Like moths to a flame, you've thrown caution to the wind for a glimpse into our world. Well, now you're in it.
Welcome to Effed Up Stories.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight, we are finally jumping into the long-promised episode of the Black Bird of Chernobyl. But more than that, this is going to be an episode of epic proportions. Let me just lay it out on the line here. This episode is going to have possible connections between the Mothman, the Black Bird of Chernobyl, the Freiburg Shrieker, the Grinning Man, also known as Indrid Cole, aliens, UFOs, the Men in Black, and a curse set down by a chief of a Native American tribe. Okay, all these things have possible connections, and it's one crazy story. So, tonight, this episode, I'm hoping you guys are going to jump in. There's so many theories, so many possibilities with this. I hope you guys are really going to have it out in the comments with this one. And just before we jump into that, I would like to say, if you have an effed up story of your own and you'd like to get it in a podcast, just go onto our official website, which is effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. Go to the submissions, submit the form. I'll get it on the website, and we'll get it into a podcast. So this began in April 1986 at the Chernobyl Nuclear plant. And for those of you who don't know anything about Chernobyl, perhaps it's best to explain that first. Chernobyl is the nuclear plant that neighbored the city of Pripyat in the Ukraine. And it's also known as the worst nuclear disaster in history. And this happened, of course, on April 26, 1986 at 1:23 a.m. in the morning. And essentially what happened is that there was a giant power surge that caused the vessel in reactor number 4 to rupture, which resulted in multiple explosions, and that sparked a fire. All the steam shot out that released large amounts of radioactive particles into the air, causing nuclear fallout over a wide geographical area. And to be specific, parts of it, just to give you an idea of how grand this was, this nuclear fallout actually penetrated parts of Eastern and Western Europe, the Western Soviet Union, the UK, Eastern North America, Scandinavia, and even Ireland. Some of these areas, in particular in the Ukraine and Russia, were hit so bad that 336,000 people had to evacuate. They had to resettle into different areas. The firefighters that responded to the fire at the plant, they didn't even realize that, it was a nuclear disaster zone at this time, and they practically all died from radiation poisoning. The people in the nearby town of Pripyat literally had to drop whatever they were doing and just get the hell out of there. In fact, you can Google, if you Google Chernobyl right now, and Google images, you'll see a ton of pictures just showing this haunted ghost town. It literally looks like everybody just vanished in the middle of what they're doing. So if they were serving dinner, their plates and their utensils is out. Their food could still, well, it's probably rotted now, but it would have been right on the table. Children's book bags are just thrown in the corner of the room. It literally looks like everybody just vanished. And you can go there, and because it's all old and decrepit and run down, it's got this really eerie vibe. And I shouldn't say you can just go there. You can pay someone to give you a tour there, and they have these Geiger counters, and they can take you to the areas that it's safe. But, there's all kinds of paranormal stories that come from there. I mean, we could do a show just on Chernobyl, stories of, well, one thing that is true anyway is that there's been all kinds of crazy mutations in both humans and animals. Some of these animals are like monstrosities that stalk in the woods and whatnot. And, there's stories of all these spirits of people who have, died in their place, if not right away when it happened, possibly from, cancer that have, come out after the fact. I mean, there were people that did not want to leave, and they just stayed in their town that might have been somewhat neighboring but still dangerous. They still got a dose of that radiation. So, lots of tragedy happened over there. In fact, that nuclear disaster is known as the absolute worst nuclear disaster that's ever been recorded. So, very, 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 very creepy. But of course, what we're going to get to here first is the Black Bird of Chernobyl. So that's the backstory of this place, and the Black Bird of Chernobyl leads up to it, okay? So, basically the way the story goes is that after the initial explosion, there were certain workers who survived that first blast. They were doomed to die of radiation poisoning, but, they kind of lived long enough to get their story out. And anyway, these workers said that on the days leading up to the meltdown, they saw a large bird-like creature. Its color was black, it had a 20-foot wingspan, a human-like body without a head, and where the shoulders would be were two smoldering red eyes. And if you're drawing parallels right now to Mothman, you're not wrong, but we'll get to that soon. So anyway, they saw this creature, and it was flying and gliding around the area, leading up to the night. And even on the night of the tragedy, there were people who claimed to have seen it flying and swirling through the clouds of billowing smoke. And, so this thing was there only around that short area of time to when it happened and on the night of. And there's some strange things there that we need to get out to digest. First of all, many workers at the plant had experienced horrific nightmares leading up to this. They had these terrible, threatening phone calls. All this happening leading up, a couple days to this event, like within a week. Some had seen the creature in the sky, and some had even spoke. They were so concerned with the culmination of this stuff, the nightmares, the threatening phone calls, seeing this creature, that some of these workers had actually gone to their boss with their concerns. And
which makes sense. I mean, you're working at a nuclear plant, and there's all kinds of weird shit going on.
Oh, hell yeah. I mean, these guys were spooked, right? And if you go and look up information on this story, and this is true for all these stories. I mean, you and I, we researched a lot of these things out of interest anyway. Mm-hmm. And what you often find is you'll find the same story almost cut and pasted on like 99% of the sites. And then you'll find a couple that have more detail than the other ones, right? They're the more fleshed out ones, perhaps the original one before someone went and hacked it, right? And anyway, on a couple of these stories, what you'll find if you dig far enough is that there's more details to the story that don't come out. And what you don't see in the slimmed down version is that one of these workers was so spooked by everything that he actually didn't go to work on the day that this meltdown happened. He was scared of it. Scared him off. He lived. He survived it because he didn't go. And, there are people that say that the Black Bird of Chernobyl served as an omen, a harbinger of tragedy. And this notion is even further reinforced when we look at there's more than two. When we look at some very similar but independent stories, and of course the first one I'm going to go to is the Mothman, because with the Mothman, well, we're just going to jump into that, but again, a harbinger of doom, we'll say, okay?
The same
tragedy
kind of situation with impending doom.
Exactly. So let's jump into some of this stuff here, because Mothman is the more known. In fact, that's probably, if most of you guys listening to this, if you heard any of this stuff before, it's most likely you heard Mothman. And, part of that is because it's the more known story, but it also helps that there was a Hollywood movie with Richard Gere made, with that name, and they did have the bridge and stuff, but, it was definitely fictionalized from the real story, Hollywood style. But anyway, so Mothman is described, you guys probably thought it as I was saying it, but he's described almost exact as the Black Bird of Chernobyl. He's this tall humanoid-looking person with a giant wingspan. He's black, got no head, and fiery red eyes near the top where his shoulders would be, kind of in between, kind of close together, actually. And the Mothman is known to have been sighted quite prominently on the night that the Silver Bridge collapsed in Point Pleasant. Again, we have this tragedy, right? This was in West Virginia, and this was also a disaster that killed 46 people. Now, when you look at Chernobyl, the initial number of people that died doesn't look as high, but definitely over time, there's been lots of people who have died from cancer. And let's not forget that a whole ton of people had to leave their home, and that place is still aside from very careful maneuvering, is kind of off limits and a death trap. So two really big disasters. And anyway, the Mothman story actually predates the Chernobyl disaster. It actually happened on December 15th, 1967, and like with the Black Bird of Chernobyl, many people had experienced horrific nightmares. They had the threatening phone calls. This is mirrored, right? They had it at the Chernobyl, exact same thing here. And led up to the tragic night where the Silver Bridge collapsed. So in Point Pleasant, in addition to that, it wasn't just, workers, like a handful of workers who had seen these strange sightings of this creature. In Point Pleasant, there was actually many, many sightings and accounts of Mothman. Just to give some examples, there's been over 100 documented in all, just to give you some idea. But like one story, for example, involved a couple who was driving on the highway, and suddenly the Mothman creature started circling their car from above, chasing them, and letting out these hideous, aggressive, unholy screams. In another story, a couple saw the Mothman standing next to this old generator plant, and as they got spooked, they sped away, and as they did so, they saw this creature suddenly somehow standing on the small hill next to the road watching them, and then it leapt into the air, like straight up, with these huge bat-like wings, and it chased them. They said they were going like 100 miles per hour, and it was able to keep up with them. And there are many, many stories like this that you'll find on the internet. It seems like, he's often sighted around these old buildings that are kind of like in these isolated areas, or simply in the middle of the road. Their headlights just come up and shine off of them. And, many of these people that encounter him, they encounter him driving their cars. I mean, the Mothman is known for attacking the roofs of their cars while they're driving, and, they've reported seeing him attack the roofs of cars even when they're parked. So, I mean, for that matter, we have a story submitted by somebody that sounds very much like he was attacked by Mothman, and, that story is going to be told as well. But anyway, like I said, there was like over 100 reported sightings of Mothman. It's the most popular of these. And, there's a belief that there's actually been many more sightings, but people are just afraid to call it in, And anyway, so you can see some of these parallels. We have the nightmares leading up to the tragedy. We have the threatening phone calls. And we have the simple fact that this creature, which is described almost verbatim in 2 different countries, 2 different times, showing up, leading up to the event of a major disaster. So again, we have this harbinger of tragedy, this omen. But also, another way that some people looked at it is like he's a savior because he's warning people of impending doom. Like it's trying to scare people away from, where this disaster is going to strike. And that's an important point because some of these other stories I have are much lesser known than even the Black Bird of Chernobyl, and it really drives that point home. So, this next story, this takes place in sometime in December of 1934. It's still West Virginia, and there's this young girl, she's like 8, and her father worked in a mine. And him and his fellow co-workers would take a train to the mine every day for work. And on Tips Eve, so it was around Christmas, and they were on their way back home when to the east they saw what they described similarly to Mothman. Now, they didn't get as good of a look at it because of the way that it was getting a little darker and it was hazy, but essentially that's what they described. And shortly after this, this girl's father started to get really sick. He had a high fever, he had chills, and when he got home, he didn't want to stay home, but his wife really wanted to. She was concerned, so she called the doctor, forced him to stay home. And here's the eerie part: when the operator picked up, the operator had explained that the doctor wasn't there. He was actually at the scene of a terrible train explosion, and said that she couldn't talk, but they knew, and they knew what it was. The train that had exploded was the one that this guy, because he was actually sick for like 3 days. I should have mentioned that when he came home sick, he was sick for 3 days before she called the doctor. Anyway, he obviously wasn't going to work, but the train that he took to go to work, that was the train that exploded. And so if he had not been sick, he would have died. And when the wife called and she got this information, and she knew, and she was dazzled, and she was able to communicate it to her husband. Hardly, she was kind of in shock, and they both broke down and cried, believing that this bird thing that they saw was somehow some kind of a divine intervention. It made him sick, but it saved his life. Now, if you want to Google that story, you'll find it looking up the locomotive boiler explosion at McDonough. But the other side of this too is this guy, this father, turns out he had polio, and he forever had a limp after that, which of course is a fair trade for your life. But as you get into more stories here, what you're going to find is that some of these people that survived, because they heeded this warning, also got what's known as a curse. And as they came out of it, they, in some way or another, bad luck had befallen them, but, they were spared, we'll say, okay?
There's always a price to be paid.
There's always a price to pay. There's a balance, right? Everything needs to be balanced. So that's that guy's story. Did Mothman come and make him sick and save his life? Well, we'll get into that in a bit. Now we're going to jump into an even lesser known story. And this took place in Germany, where there's a city called, I guess it's Freiburg, Freiberg. That's my assumption.
Sounds about right to me.
So, so this happened on September 10th, 1978. We're workers of a local mine, so we have mine workers again. And, when they went to work, they saw in the distance what they thought was a man wearing a black trench coat that was blocking the entrance to the mine. And when they got close enough, they realized that this wasn't a trench coat. It was actually these giant black wings wrapped around a humanoid, again, and they described it just like how people described the Mothman and the Black Bird of Chernobyl. So I'm thinking we're looking at the same creature here. And, once they got close enough, the creature unfurled its wings around its body and it let out these giant, terrifying screams, which they described as sounding like a mix between the screams of 50 men and the sound of a train's emergency brakes.
Jeez.
Right? And I mean, when you look at Mothman, especially because there's more stories, you're going to hear these, again, he has this terrifying screech that people note hearing. And naturally, these miners, they hauled ass in the opposite direction. And when they felt that they were at a safe distance from what they dubbed, by the way, as the Freiberg Shrieker, they just started to clean up the area around the mine, thinking that eventually whatever this thing was going to leave and they could go back to work. And after about an hour of doing this, they felt this massive, just absolutely massive rumble in the ground. And this turned out to be a massive subterranean explosion in the very mine they were going to work in. So they ran up to the mine and they discovered that the creature was gone. But if they had been able to get into the mine to go to work, and there was 36 of them, by the way, if they had been able to get in there, they all would have died. And, apparently, all these guys that survived, they got this kind of a curse. They were cursed with mental disorders and having unusual bad luck finding work or getting money after this had happened. In fact, there was 2 guys from the group that dedicated their whole lives to finding out what this thing was. They wanted to get to some kind of truth behind it. And those 2 guys somehow managed to die very unusually young. And as bad as the other guys were, these guys were poorer. They were, they died younger. They had worse luck. The guys who wanted to dive into this thing is like their curse was greater. And it's said that, some people say in some circles that this same kind of curse had actually happened to some of those who've witnessed Mothman in Point Pleasant. And, what do we know from the guy from the train accident? Well, he had a permanent limp from polio. So here's some corroborating stories. These people are spared, but they have some kind of a curse to balance this out. So now we have these 4 stories, right? We got the Chernobyl, we got Mothman at Point Pleasant, we got the guy on the train, and we got these miners, right? 4 stories where Mothman shows up and tries to scare away people from tragedy. In some cases, he do. In every one of these stories, there's some people to get away, right? But there's tons more stories, in that corroborate this as well. But let's look at some of the more interesting tie-ins, because it even gets deeper than that. You may or may not have heard of a person referred to as the Grinning Man, and he's also known as Indrid Cold. And to give him a description, you Google him, you're going to see some creepy-ass pictures, but he's extremely tall, very broad, and green. He has beady eyes that are set far apart, no ears, no nose. To some degree, he kind of looks like, was it Voldemort from Harry Potter, right? But anyway, the one thing that's, not that the rest of it isn't distinctive, but the thing that's really notable about him is this very, very wide, ominous grin. And that's where he gets the name the Grinning Man. It's this creepy ass, wide, creepy grin. And he's been spotted, jumping like impossibly tall fences extremely quickly before flashing a creepy grin at onlookers. He's been noted for chasing people, and there were reports of him being around the area where the Mothman sightings and, where all that stuff happened around the same time. And he has, there's stories of him telepathically interrogating people about UFO sightings in the air. Because one thing that I haven't really touched on up till now, because I'm trying not to get it too complicated, but
because there's so many facets to this. I know where you're going. It's the Men in Black.
It is. It's crazy because at Chernobyl there was reports of around this time of sightings of UFO and UFO activity. At Point Pleasant there was reportings of UFO activity and weird lights in the sky and stuff like that.
And what people might not know about Point Pleasant was that the Men in Black sightings at the time were more of a story than the actual Mothman, because it was more intrusive. According to some of the people, that the Men in Black sightings preceded many of the Mothman sightings, and then went on for a while longer after the bridge collapse.
Well, the Men in Black were very prominent at Point Pleasant, and it's interesting because when we think of the Men in Black, we think, okay, well, the obvious tie-ins to UFO activity. They're always around to question the UFO activity. I'm not sure if I remember reading if the Men in Black were at Chernobyl, but for sure, people did cite UFO and strange lights in the skies leading up to the event. But Indrid Cold, getting back to the Grinning Man, the interesting tie-in there with the Men in Black is that he's admitted or has said that he's not from this earth, and by his description, he doesn't sound like he's from this earth. And this is where the really interesting story from him comes from. And I should say it's not from him. It's from a guy named Woodrow Derenberger. And he claims that he was basically on the road. He was driving his truck, and this strange vehicle that had a similar shape to like a kerosene lamp. It was kind of bulbous in the center and tapered to the top. Basically, this weird vehicle in that shape had fallen out of the sky onto the road in front of him. He had to slam on his brakes. And as this happened, a hatch opened up where this tall, broad, creepy-looking, Indrid Cold stepped out, just as I described him before. Now, here's the thing about that is that Woodrow claims that Indrid Cold, how did he get his name? Well, the way he got this name is that he interrogated him telepathically about what, the stuff he saw in the sky. He actually interrogated him telepathically, and he introduced himself as Indrid Cold. The nickname Grinning Man is just from people who cited him, but he introduced himself as Indrid Cold to Derenberger. And the interesting thing here, it's all interesting, but those threatening phone calls that were made in Point Pleasant leading up to the bridge collapse, right? Well, some people that were were involved with all of this, who got caught up in it, said that they'd gotten these strange calls. And so we have these people getting these threatening phone calls, and then we have these people getting these calls from a guy who, says his name is Indrid Cold, okay? And Indrid Cold had told these people he's from another planet, and that he was investigating some of the UFO sightings that were happening in the area at the time. And I mean, you just got to look at this, right? You got the Mothman showing up. You got the men in black crawling all over that place. And then you got this weird, otherworldly humanoid guy, alien, falling from the sky. I mean, is it possible that these perceived threatening phone calls, what if all these phone calls were Indrid Cold, or maybe a mix of him and the men in black, right?
And don't forget all of the, highly disturbing premonitions and dreams.
Yeah, you got the terrible nightmares leading up to this, and this bad, everybody having this bad feeling, the premonition that something's happening. You got the omen of the Black Bird of Chernobyl, and it almost seems like the men in black and Indrid Cold, like, just trying to make sense of what they're there. Are they there investigating what's going on, or are they there as part of it? Are they somehow responsible? And like, some people have wondered if Indrid Cold was not the one that was calling and threatening people, or maybe people took it that way. I mean, obviously he was strange. He probably had a strange way of talking. And the other interesting thing is that we have these UFO sightings parallel with Chernobyl and Point Pleasant, and I mean, it's possible that the other areas could have it. It's just that they're so low key in comparison. It's really hard to find more information. These were really major events at Chernobyl and Point Pleasant, so we have a lot of witnesses, right? So we got all this stuff here, and then now we have this final piece to the puzzle that's just as weird or weirder, and this is called the Cornstalk curse. And I can almost see you guys like scratching your heads, like, how the hell does all this fit together? Well, hear me out. So this actually predates all of it, okay? It happened 200 years before Mothman, and before this, all this stuff happened, okay? And basically there was a great war between the white man and 7 Native American tribes who had allied together to keep the white man out. And the most powerful tribe was known as the Shawnees, okay? And their chief, I don't know how to pronounce his language name, but it translates to Cornstalk. And essentially what happened was this, terrible bloody war, transpires between the white man and these Native Americans. But eventually, Cornstalk, he wants to make peace with the white colonials. He just, he doesn't really want war. He wants to make peace. And the other tribes, however, they still want to go and wage this war. So while they went on to go and wage war, Chief Cornstalk went to negotiate peace with the garrison commander, the white guy. And, once he found out that these other tribes were, I think he said something to him like, what if, we attacked these other tribes or whatever. And he said he'd have like no choice but to attack or whatever. And with that, he took him hostage. And by all accounts, he took him hostage and someone else, but they weren't like mean to them. Like they were kind of put up in a good spot. They had good food. They weren't, on bad terms, we'll say, aside from the forced having to stay there while this whole thing got sorted out. But, eventually things went sour, not because of, the chief or just the garrison, but, the other war going on with the other tribes and the white guys. It blew over in a way where Chief Cornstalk's son ends up getting murdered in front of him, right out of sight actually, and then the chief ended up getting killed as well. And as he laid there on his back, bleeding out and dying on the floor, he cursed the land. And actually there's a whole bunch of stuff that he said, but yeah, he totally cursed the land. And, after he had died, they had moved the chief's body a couple of times after they buried him. Eventually, it settled in one of Point Pleasant's parks. And since then, people who have kept track of this, the Cornstalk curse has been blamed for many, many tragedies. And I'm just going to go over this little list here. It was blamed for the worst coal mine disaster in history, which happened in 1907 on December 6th in Monongah, West Virginia, where 310 miners were killed. In 1944, a tornado killed 150 people in the tri-state area. Again, they blamed this curse. There was an infamous collapse, the Silver Bridge that we discussed, 1967, and Mothman killed 46. Again, they attributed this to the curse. There was a plane crash in 1968, killing 35, and another plane crash killed 100. Killed 75 people. There was an explosion in the Mason Country Jail in Point Pleasant. That was weird because they arrested a guy, and his wife, who was coming in to pay bail, actually brought in a suitcase full of explosives, which killed her, her husband, and 3 law enforcement staff. That was 1976.
Guess she underestimated the yield.
Oh, hell yeah. Oh, hell yeah. A little bit too much. But, again, blamed on the curse. Another thing was a freight train that crashed that spilled tons of toxic chemicals, which contaminate the town's water supply, 1978. And again, in 1978, there was a scaffolding that was holding 51 construction workers, which collapsed and killed them all. And, lastly, and perhaps more pertinent, because we're seeing all these curses that allegedly are tied to this Cornstalk curse. Well, this is probably the most important part to tie it all together. And that is that people say Chief Cornstalk's curse was said to have conjured an old native spirit known as the Thunderbird, which some people say is Mothman. And this story predates everything else that happened, right? So it was
in 1777, I think, was when Cornstalk died.
Right. So we have a lot of questions now. We have, is the origin of all of these things, the Chernobyl, Mothman, the Mothman and Point Pleasant, the miners, all these different things, is the origin of all this stuff a curse of Chief Cornstalk? Is it, is that what the manifestation of Mothman is?
Mothman's not necessarily warning, he's actually causing these, causes Chernobyl, as the Black Bird, causes the bridge to collapse.
It could be the curse on the white man for killing Chief Cornstalk, right? And at the same time, if he is being an omen, we'll say, for that side, because some people were saved. Maybe he only scares away people who are worthy, like he can read people and know that, because he seems to specifically get certain people to go away. Maybe he knows he can read people. This guy is a good soul. I'm going to scare him away or whatever, right? Now,
he's 1/17th native. I guess I'll give him a
he gets Indian status.
Yeah.
Right? And then we got these crazy UFO sightings. The seemingly completely different phenomenon that are somehow all within the time that this stuff is going on, all within the sighting and within the time of these tragedies. Like, people are citing this leading up to the tragedy with Mothman. And then on top of this, we got the Men in Black there, and we have this seemingly alien-human hybrid known as Indrid Cold interrogating people about UFOs, perhaps Mothman, perhaps both, and he might be making these threatening phone calls. So we have a nasty web of craziness in this, in a way that there's possible connections that I have never seen put that way before.
Geez, it's one of those. It's one of these stories or series of stories that almost necessitates a CIA style blackboard with a bunch of pictures and lines drawn in between them. because how's the saying go? What a tangled web.
It's absolutely crazy. And I mean, truthfully, I didn't want to go into too much detail because we could probably do a podcast just on Injured Cold.
Well, that's what I was going to say. We could do a podcast, on each of these stories individually. It's just, that's been done. So let's, it's much more interesting to discuss all these things as a series of connecting events in a way. Chernobyl would definitely seem like an outlier because everything else takes place within the United States, and much of it around Virginia.
Germany too,
and Germany, and then of course we have Chernobyl, which is happens in Russia, but the Black Bird of Chernobyl, that is the exact description of Mothman. I don't think anybody reading those two descriptions side by side could ever not or say that those aren't linked. It's like they're identical.
Even like the nightmares and the what I find, the one thing that you could tag to all of this is that it was always aside from all of it was that there was a tragedy, right? It wasn't just one person getting killed. We have a nuclear meltdown. We have a giant bridge collapsing with tons of people on it during the Christmas season. We got a train exploding. We have the mine. I guess nobody died there, but it could have been a massive tragedy. That would be
a potential for dozens of people to die simultaneously.
Yeah, and what was there something else, I think, or maybe that was it for the big ones.
We got so much stuff going on here, we can't keep track.
But it's nuts, right? And then when we get to the Cornstalk curse, that happened in West Virginia. And, I find it interesting that, the native chief, Chief Cornstalk, they moved his body around. That's one thing that in any horror movie you ever see, disturbed dead people remains being moved.
Especially, Indian burial grounds. You don't go messing around in Indian burial grounds.
Especially Indian burial grounds. So, he lays this curse. They move his body around. It ends up resting in Point Pleasant, and that's where, this Mothman sighting starts. And, then we have people saying that his curse was actually for this Thunderbird spirit.
Cornstalk even led a force of warriors at a battle called the Battle of Point Pleasant.
Well, yeah, that was the big, the big war that I was referring to. And one other thing though that I thought of when I was reading this, and there's nobody that's ever asked this or wondered about it or mentioned it, but you and I, we did a podcast on Dulce, and
yes.
And what we know about Dulce was that on like layer 7, like the deepest layer, there was these vats, and these vats had human-like, bat-like hybrids, and one automatically has to think Mothman, right? So the question then becomes, maybe everything we just said, we don't know anyway, but what if, because we're looking at West Virginia, we're looking at Point Pleasant and this curse, and now we know that stuff happened in Germany, we know stuff happened in Russia. Is there more than one? Is it not, the cause of a curse, but some of these escaped, experiments from level 7 of Dulce, these human bat-like hybrids that escaped, and perhaps they're warning, perhaps they're I don't know.
Well, I mean, if we're going to take everything as a group event, we're looking at what, almost 300 years in terms of a time span.
Hell of a
you
time.
know to over 200 years anyway. 1774 to what was the most recent event was in the 80s. That's a huge time span. The Grinning Man, what was the time span for that? That's in the 60s.
1967.
1967. There you go. There's such a large span of time, but at the same time, we're looking at such a bizarre correlation of events. This bizarre green-skinned creature, the smiling man and his telepathic interrogations, the connections with UFOs. To me, personally, it strikes me more, not so much as a Dulce themed kind of idea, as more perhaps extra dimensional.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
You have this connection with spirit, Indian chiefs and spirits and premonitions and dreams, curses, strange flying creatures, the Thunderbird, this bizarre green grinning man, who straight up says, I ain't from around here. And then if the Men in Black are part of a secret government organization, those poor bastards trying to sort through that mess. They got a bridge collapse and strange dreams, and spirits and UFOs. But the whole thing, for me, it strikes me as kind of a, maybe in that area during that period of time, there was for some reason, things were leaking into our reality, things that, as far as we know, shouldn't be here. Because just, what a chaotic, bizarre string of events.
Oh yeah, and like, I don't know how much I tied to the connection of this Cornstalk curse.
Well, there's always an Indian curse, isn't there?
Oh yeah. Well,
we got in the city I live in, Calgary. We have a notorious stretch of road. Is a part of the highway system. It's called Deerfoot, and it's named after I believe Chief Deerfoot or his son. And again, somebody killed him, and there was this curse that forever there would be this curse on the land. And this stretch of road, I don't think there's any stretch of road in the city that claims more lives every year. In fact, they had a ceremony to lift the curse with some representatives of local natives.
Wow. I find a lot of people are skeptical at first of these things until these curses lead into their lives. I just, mostly with curses, you hear bad luck, you hear, stuff like that happening. You might see a couple things, but a manifestation of a, terrifying creature, the Mothman, the Black Bird of Chernobyl, this thing with a 20-foot wide wingspan, it's a humanoid yet doesn't have a head, has these fiery red eyes.
Right above its shoulders, or where its shoulders would be, right?
Yeah, I mean, even that in itself, I mean, if you look at like every creature, for the most part, we all have a head of some sort, and this one looks it is said to have the body of a human, and it looks like his head is chopped off. It makes me wonder if Chief Cornstalk's head wasn't chopped off, and this was like the culmination of Chief Cornstalk, his body with a bat because that was a spirit creature or something, and his eyes are red because he's pissed, and he's coming back to seek vengeance on, the kind that killed him and his son and drove him from his land.
Well, and a lot of times, if you look into Native American culture, and I mean all across this great continent of ours, from from the territories all the way down into South America, we look at the amazing artwork that has survived to the modern time from these cultures, and some of the forms of the spirits that they draw. I mean, they're wild and fantastical shapes that have, sometimes they have a they're analogous to other things in the natural world, like human animal hybrids, but just as often they're not. And I mean, there are several depictions of Native American, whether that be, Native American or First Nations people in Canada, or Native South American. The depictions I have seen, headless beings, or beings that at least don't have a neck, and the body and the head kind of flow into one another. Very bizarre features. The spirit world, as they tell it, and I mean, I'm no expert, but I have done quite a bit of study and reading and watching documentaries on many different native cultures all over the American continent. There's this massive array, a whole cosmology, or pantheon, I should say, of spirit beings. And it doesn't, for me anyway, it doesn't require a large leap in my head to imagine one of these bizarre creatures, coming off the page, as it were, and into the real world, and what kind of a terrifying image that would strike. Like you said, this 6 to 8 foot tall headless being with a 15 to 20 foot wide wingspan, with arms, legs, and glowing red eyes, right above its shoulders or around its shoulder area. I mean, that's a striking image. And I mean, if we're trying to relate this into a modern world, one where we accept that there may be other worlds and other dimensions that we don't have everyday access to, well, perhaps there's all kinds of people or beings that exist that are in all kinds of these bizarre configurations that we just, we can't wrap our heads around. The Mothman, definitely, the Mothman and the Grinning Man being two very prime examples.
They're exquisite. I only wish that video game creators were so creative, like instead of the humanoid alien with the red spot where you shoot them. I would love to just have that in my media, that kind of stuff. I mean, for me,
too much creativity breeds risk, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately. But like for me, Mothman has always been one of my favorite cryptids, and it was a while ago that I started digging and I found the Black Bird of Chernobyl, and then it was all the smaller accounts that I found in different like the one in Germany, and then coming across this, curse, and there's just so many possible connections there that it goes deeper than I ever thought that it would. And
the shrieking Mothman in Germany.
Yeah, it's just, it's so much more prominent than I thought it would be. Like everybody thinks of Mothman as simply the
was
point.
Just Point Pleasant, yeah.
And it's not. And we're looking at a possible spanning of like 300 years. Perhaps there's journals from 100 years ago or more of somebody describing just such a creature, and we just haven't uncovered it. Or perhaps it's in some rich businessman's possession as a relic of a time long gone. Who knows? But
that's the great thing about our modern era with the internet. We're able to reach out and connect. You and I are speaking over, hundreds of miles or thousands. I don't know. It's a long distance. We're on opposite sides of this massive country of ours, and we're reaching out to people all over the world. And who knows? Somebody listening right now may be sitting there wide-eyed because they're like, "Holy shit, I've seen that." And now for the first time in human history, we have an opportunity to kind of collect all these stories into little archives, and I mean, really, that's Effed Up Stories has become an archive. We have so many stories there now.
We do, and it's pretty amazing, actually, especially because they're almost all stories I haven't heard before from people who stumbled across our show. So, guys, I really hope that you enjoyed that story as much as I did researching it, because I just found the whole thing amazing. It's one of the subjects that I found most interesting, especially when I came across all those possible connections. And again, if you have your own effed up story, we ask that you submit that to us at effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com, and we'll get it on the website and into a podcast. And that concludes our cryptid theme. Our cryptid themed podcast that we're going to group together for the time. We got tons of stories, guys. Like, I've been sent a ton of stories from you people in the past couple months, and some of them are awesome. And as we did this is the second time we've done this theme thing. We did it with near-death experiences, and then we did it with this one. And what we noticed is that, we wouldn't know until we tried, but what we noticed is that kind of a breakdown happens where I understand it. The views kind of drop off a bit. You're kind of over.
It's too much of a good thing.
Yeah, oversaturated with the same kind of stories, and that makes perfect sense. We weren't gonna do it with the cryptid ones after we watched the near-death experience ones like that, but we promised everybody that we were, and so anybody who sent them in, I wanted to do that because that's probably why they sent it in, right? Like, I just wanted to kind of honor that. But from now on, I think we're gonna keep it, kind of varied up, and we're just gonna keep going through people's submissions, and we're eventually, we're gonna try different things at different times, because what we're trying to do is give you guys the best show that we can do. So we're always tweaking and prodding, and
requires some experimentation.
Yeah. So, but that said, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I definitely did enjoy getting your stories, and stay tuned because we got tons of awesome stories that have already been sent in that I very much look forward to sharing with you all. And with that said, have a good night.
Thank you very much for listening, everyone.